Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going back in time to mid-20th century Baltimore
Okay.
to look at something called the Baltimore Plan.
Interesting.
It sounds pretty straightforward, right? A housing plan.
Yeah.
But the thing is, this plan was meant to make things better with housing, but it may have actually made inequality worse.
Yeah. That's the real head scratcher, isn't it?
And to really get into all the details, we have this scholarly article that dives deep into the plan.
Right into the nitty gritty.
Yeah, and all the unintended consequences that came with it.
You know, it's fascinating because the Baltimore Plan got a lot of praise across the country.
Really?
Oh, yeah. People saw it as this brand new way to deal with bad housing.
Mm.
But as you mentioned, the reality is way more complex.
Okay, so let's set the stage here. We're looking at Baltimore in the early 1900s. What was it like in terms of housing back then, especially for African-American residents?
Well, picture this Baltimore in the early 20th century,
Okay.
a city grappling with a major housing crisis.
Oh.
And for African-American residents, this meant dealing with substandard housing all over the place, lacking the basic things you need to live decently.
So not just a few rundown places here and there.
Oh, no, not at all. We're talking widespread issues.
Okay.
And there's this report from way back in 1907
Wow.
by Janet Kemp. It's called Housing Perditions in Baltimore. And it's really important because it shows that these problems we're talking up today, they aren't new. Over a century ago, people were already raising concerns about the awful living conditions.
They were saying, hey, this is a serious problem.
Exactly. And they were demanding action.
So did the city listen? Did they take any steps to fix things?
Well, there were some attempts. The city did implement housing codes in 1908.
Okay.
But there's another crucial piece to this puzzle in 1911.
Okay.
Baltimore put in place the very first residential segregation ordinance in the entire country.
Oh, wow. So you have these efforts to improve housing,
Right.
but then segregation comes into the picture. Did that change things?
Well, these segregation ordinances essentially boxed African Americans into a very limited housing market. It created what we call a captive market for landlords. And sadly, some landlords took advantage of that. They could charge high rents for housing that was in terrible shape,
Wow.
knowing that their tenants had very few options.
It's like setting people up to fail in a system they can't escape.
It's a really tough situation.
So we've got a housing crisis brewing, calls for action going, ignored for years, and then, bam, the Great Depression hits.
Yeah.
How did the New Deal, with its emphasis on government stepping in, play into all of this?
The New Deal brought a big shift in how people thought about the government's role. Suddenly, the idea that the government should step in and fix problems in society gained traction.
Right.
And housing was definitely high on the list.
So did public housing projects become like the main solution?
Not so fast. The idea of government-built housing faced strong opposition, primarily from Baltimore's real estate industry.
Makes sense. I guess they weren't thrilled about the government potentially becoming their biggest competition.
Precisely. They saw public housing as a direct threat to their profits.
Interesting.
They called it a permanent dole, and they actually managed to block PWA projects in Baltimore.
That's pretty powerful considering the evidence of terrible housing conditions.
It was a significant victory for the real estate industry.
So what was the alternative? If public housing was off the table, what did the city do?
Well, that's when the Baltimore Plan came into play.
Okay.
In 1941, the city passed something called the Ordinance on the Hygiene of Housing.
Okay.
It was presented as this middle ground between stricter housing codes and the government building new units.
So the idea was to make landlords responsible for fixing up their existing properties.
Exactly. The Baltimore Plan seemed like a win-win on the surface. The city could show they were taking housing concerns seriously without getting into the controversy of public housing,
Right.
and landlords would be legally required to make improvements.
Sounds reasonable enough in theory. But this is a deep dive.
Right.
So was it really effective? Did the Baltimore Plan actually work?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The short answer is not really. The plan ran into a lot of problems right from the start.
Like what made it so difficult to put the plan into action?
Well, first off, resources were tight. You also had magistrates who weren't exactly eager to enforce the new codes.
Oh.
And then you had landlords who were constantly finding ways to bend the rules or just slip through loopholes.
So it wasn't smooth sailing.
Not at all.
Sounds like a classic case of good intentions hitting a wall of reality.
Definitely.
You have this plan that sounds good on paper, but putting it into practice is a whole other ballgame. And then to make things even more complicated, World War II starts.
You got it. The war brought a massive wave of workers to Baltimore, putting a huge strain on housing
Oh,
resources.
wow. Talk about adding fuel to the
It
fire.
was definitely not ideal timing.
So we've got this plan that's struggling to get off the ground, a housing crisis made worse by the war. What happened next? Did the Baltimore Plan just fade away?
It's interesting, actually. Despite all those roadblocks, the Baltimore Plan actually gained national attention.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
How did a struggling plan suddenly become so popular?
Well, Mayor McKeldin enters the picture after the war. He really gets behind the Baltimore Plan, invests resources, and even sets up a dedicated housing court.
Wow. So he's like, we're making this happen one way or another.
Uh,
It's pretty bold.
It was a big statement. But here's where things get even trickier. The Baltimore Plan did start making some progress on the ground, but it was the positive media coverage that really launched it into the national spotlight.
It's amazing how much public perception can shape things, even if the reality is more complicated.
It's a powerful force.
Hmm.
So even though the Baltimore Plan was still facing challenges at home, it started to gain traction nationwide.
Wow.
It was being praised as the perfect solution to address substandard housing without the government needing to build new properties. But, and this is a big but,
I have a feeling this is where those unintended consequences come back to bite us. What was the downside of all this attention?
you see, despite its good intentions, the Baltimore Plan ultimately made the very inequalities it was meant to fix even worse. It focused on the symptoms, things like rundown buildings and bad sanitation, instead of tackling the root cause,
Which was?
racial segregation and an exploitative real estate system.
So it's like treating a cough without addressing the underlying lung infection. You might feel better temporarily, but the problem's still there simmering beneath the surface.
That's a great way to put it. We talked about how Baltimore's segregation ordinances created this captive market for landlords.
Right.
They could profit from offering terrible housing because people had nowhere else to go. And the Baltimore Plan didn't change that fundamental power dynamic.
So even though the plan was getting all this praise back in Baltimore, it wasn't really living up to its promises.
Yeah.
That's tough to hear. How did it manage to become so influential on a national level then?
You have to remember the political climate at the time. This was the post-war era. Anti-communist sentiment was on the rise. People were suspicious of government involvement, and the private sector was seen as the answer to most problems. The Baltimore Plan fit perfectly into that narrative.
It was a convenient solution for those who didn't want the government building and managing housing. They could say, look, we can solve this without big government programs.
Exactly. And this was also the time when we saw suburbs growing rapidly, fueled by government policies that helped white families buy homes in the suburbs while neglecting investment in cities.
So while white families were encouraged to move to the suburbs, black families were left to deal with inadequate housing and ongoing discrimination in the city.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And here's the real kicker. The Baltimore Plan, with its focus on individual responsibility and self-help, ended up shifting the burden onto tenants instead of addressing the systemic problems that were trapping them.
It's like saying, just try harder to someone who's stuck in a system designed to hold them down.
Exactly. That's the issue. The plan pushed this idea that if people just took better care of their homes, the problem of bad housing would disappear. But it completely ignored the fact that many residents didn't have the money, the credit, or even the opportunities to make those improvements.
It's incredibly frustrating, especially when you factor in things like discriminatory lending practices. Even if residents wanted to make repairs, they often couldn't get loans because of their race or where they lived.
Absolutely. Redlining, the practice of denying loans or insurance to people based on their race or neighborhood, was rampant back then. It was like a cruel catch-22.
It is. It's a vicious cycle. Discriminatory housing policies lead to concentrated poverty and lack of investment, which then makes it impossible for residents to improve their living conditions, and then they get blamed for the very problems they're trapped in.
Exactly. And that's how a plan that starts with good intentions ends up reinforcing existing power structures and actually making inequality worse.
It's a cautionary tale about quick fixes and failing to address the root causes of social problems. But how did the Baltimore Plan, with all its flaws, manage to gain so much influence and popularity? It just doesn't add up.
Part of it has to do with the success of something called the pilot program,
Okay.
a highly publicized initiative within the Baltimore Plan. This program zeroed in on a small area in East Baltimore, concentrating enforcement efforts and promoting community involvement.
So it was like a mini version of the Baltimore Plan, showcasing its success to win over a wider audience.
You got it. But here's where things get even more complicated. To make the pilot program look successful, the city actually shifted its strategy. Instead of strictly enforcing the codes, they started focusing more on community organizing and education.
So instead of cracking down on landlords, they encouraged residents to take charge and work together to improve their neighborhood. Sounds like a good idea in theory, but was it really effective?
That's the key question. They organized cleanup days, offered advice on home repairs, and even created something called the Brotherhood Pilot House to show residents how they could renovate their homes. But it wasn't a magic solution.
It sounds like they were trying to empower the community. But could that really solve the underlying issues of poverty and discrimination? Was it just a Band-Aid?
You hit the nail on the head. While there were some positive outcomes like improved sanitation and a sense of community, the pilot program didn't deliver on all its promises. Many residents simply didn't have the resources to make the necessary repairs, and the program didn't address those systemic barriers.
It's a strange situation. The Baltimore Plan isn't achieving its goals in Baltimore, but it's being celebrated nationwide as a model for urban renewal. It seems like the perception of success became more important than the actual results.
And that perception was carefully crafted by powerful groups who stood to benefit from the Baltimore Plan's popularity. The real estate industry saw it as a way to avoid the threat of public housing and maintain their control over the housing market.
It's a classic example of a seemingly simple solution being co-opted by powerful interests, even if it ultimately fails to deliver on its promises. But how did all of this play out on a national level? Did the Baltimore Plan really influence federal policy?
The Baltimore Plan's influence reached its peak with the 1954 Housing Act,
Okay.
a major piece of legislation that shaped federal housing policy for decades. This act embraced the idea of urban renewal, but with a heavy emphasis on code enforcement and private sector solutions, just like the Baltimore Plan.
Oh, so the Baltimore Plan, despite its shortcomings, became a blueprint for how the federal government approached urban housing. That's incredible and a little unsettling considering its mixed results. It shows how local policies can have a ripple effect across the entire country.
It also shows how important it is to be critical of simple solutions, especially when it comes to complex social problems like housing inequality. We need to look beyond the surface and ask ourselves, who benefits from this approach? Are we really addressing the root causes of the problem?
Those are some important questions to consider. Speaking of important questions, how did the Baltimore Plan ultimately come to an end?
Well, by the 1960s, the cracks were really starting to show.
In the plan.
Yeah. Even the people who initially supported the Baltimore Plan were starting to see its flaws. The city's housing situation wasn't getting much better, and the emphasis on code enforcement, well, it was starting to look like a way to push out low-income residents.
Instead of helping them.
Yeah, instead of providing them with decent housing.
So it kind of backfired. Instead of helping people stay in their homes, it ended up forcing them out.
In a lot of cases, yes. The focus on enforcing those codes led to a lot of homes being demolished. They were deemed unfit for habitation.
Right.
And this displacement, it hit Black communities the hardest, which just made the racial disparities in housing even worse.
It's really sad how a plan meant to improve housing ended up contributing to the very problems it was trying to solve.
It really shows how important it is to understand just how complex social issues are. Those simplistic solutions, they often miss the underlying power dynamics and systemic inequalities that keep these problems going.
So what happened next? Did the city come up with a new plan? What did they do to address the housing crisis that was still going on?
The Baltimore Plan wasn't dismantled overnight. It was a gradual process.
Okay.
As the limitations of code enforcement became clearer, the city started exploring other options. They looked at things like investing more in public housing and community development programs.
It sounds like they were finally starting to get that they needed more comprehensive solutions. Did those new approaches work any better than the Baltimore Plan?
Now, that's a whole other deep dive. The history of housing policy is full of twists and turns, successes and failures. It's a field that's always changing, and there's always more to learn and explore.
For sure. This deep dive into the Baltimore Plan has been eye-opening, if not a little bit disheartening. It's amazing how a seemingly simple idea can have such far-reaching and often unintended consequences.
Absolutely. It reminds us to be careful and thoughtful when we try to tackle social problems.
Right.
We need to listen to the people who are most affected by these policies and make sure that our solutions are addressing the root causes of inequality, not just the surface level stuff.
It's about going beyond those Band-Aid fixes and really getting to the core of these social issues.
Exactly. It takes a commitment to real systemic change, even if it's not the easy or popular choice.
The Baltimore Plan is a stark reminder that good intentions alone aren't enough. We have to be aware of those potential unintended consequences and keep asking ourselves, are our policies truly helping the people they're supposed to help?
And maybe even more importantly, we have to listen to the people who are directly impacted by these policies. Their lived experiences are so valuable in understanding the real impact of our decisions.
It's a powerful reminder that real progress means confronting the complexities of social issues and working towards a world that's fair and just for everyone.
Well said. The Baltimore Plan gives us a lot to think about. What can we take from this experience and apply to the housing challenges we face today? How can we make sure our policies are targeting the root causes of inequality and creating a housing system that's fair and just for everyone?
Those are some great questions to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Baltimore Plan. It's been a fascinating and thought-provoking journey through history. We encourage you to keep exploring this topic and think about what we can learn from the past to create a better future. We'll leave you with that to ponder. Until next time.
You know, it's amazing to think the Baltimore Plan started in just one city,
Yeah,
but it had such a huge impact on housing policies all over the country.
right. It really shows you how powerful perception can be
It does.
and how those in power can shape the narrative to keep things the way they are.
Absolutely.
But it's a warning too, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
It reminds us that we can't just try to fix the surface level of inequality.
Right.
We have to go deeper and address the root causes.
I completely agree. And the Baltimore Plan, it started out focusing on holding landlords accountable,
Right.
but in the end, it shifted the burden onto the residents.
Yeah, and a lot of those residents just didn't have the resources to meet those new standards.
Exactly.
So instead of breaking the cycle of poverty and disinvestment, it actually made it worse.
That's a crucial point. It's something we've seen time and time again throughout history. The focus is often on individual responsibility and self-reliance,
Yeah.
but without creating an environment where people actually have opportunities to succeed.
It's like asking someone to climb a ladder with missing rungs.
I like that analogy. It really highlights how important it is to look beyond the surface
Yeah.
and understand who holds the power in these situations, who benefits from the way things are, whose voices are being silenced. Are we really working towards a society that's fair and just for everyone?
Those are some big questions.
Yeah.
So if we take a step back and look at the Baltimore Plan and what it left behind,
Yeah.
what's the main takeaway for us today?
I think the most important lesson is to be cautious about simple solutions to complex problems. We need to be willing to challenge the prevailing narratives and ask those tough questions about the systems that perpetuate inequality.
It's about moving beyond those temporary fixes and really getting to the heart of the issue.
Exactly. It requires a commitment to real systemic change, even if it's not the easy or popular path.
The Baltimore Plan really drives home the point that good intentions aren't enough. We need to be aware of those potential unintended consequences and always ask ourselves, are our policies truly benefiting the people they're meant to help?
And I think, just as importantly, we need to listen to the people who are directly affected by these policies. Their lived experiences are crucial to understanding the true impact of our choices.
It's a powerful reminder that real progress means tackling the complexities of social issues head-on and working to build a world where everyone has a fair chance.
Well said. The Baltimore Plan definitely gives us a lot to think about. What can we learn from it and apply to the housing problems we face today? How can we ensure our policies are addressing the root causes of inequality and creating a housing system that's truly fair and just for everyone?
Those are great questions worth pondering. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Baltimore Plan. It's been a fascinating and thought-provoking journey. We encourage you to keep learning about this topic and think about what we can take from the past to create a better future for everyone. Until next time.